Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As you're coming in, please feel free to write your name and your organization in the chat box so we can try to see who's here and welcome you all. And we'll get started with the webinar as soon as people are done coming in, maybe another minute or so. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. But again, please feel free to share your name, your title and organization, and where you're joining us from in the chat box, just so you all can get acclimated with one another. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining SchoolHouse Connection and our policy fellow, Mobile Burrell, for our webinar today on student homelessness and what the Massachusetts communities can do about it. And for those of you who are not familiar with SchoolHouse Connection, we are a national organization that really works to overcome homelessness through education. We recognize that in order to do that, we have to provide strategic advocacy and assistance to all of our advocates across the country. And so we do this through meaningful partnerships with schools, early childhood programs, colleges and universities, service providers, families, and youth who are actually impacted by homelessness. And so my name is Ashanti Jones. I am the Senior Policy Advocacy Manager here at SchoolHouse Connection. And I'm also joined here by my colleague, Rod Montz, who's monitoring the Q&A and the chat. And so we do encourage you that as we proceed throughout this webinar, as you have questions, comments, just want to give a kudos or a +1 to anything that you hear, please utilize the chat box and the Q&A, and we'll be sure to answer those questions during the time that we have here together. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end just to answer some of those live. And if not, my contact information is right here. So we'll be able to answer those once if you reach out. Okay, and so SchoolHouse Connection itself does a lot of federal and state policy advocacy. We answer questions that we get in our email address, which is info@schoolhouseconnection.org. So feel free to utilize that as a post-webinar experience as well. And we host webinars like this one and other implementation tools. And we also partner with young people who have experienced homelessness or who are currently experiencing homelessness with our Youth Leadership and Scholarship Program. And so our Policy Fellows program is what brings us here today, right? And the aim of our Policy Fellows program is really to connect with advocates and really strong leaders across the country to mobilize them to be able to do this legislative advocacy that we really need at both the federal and state levels to ensure that our young people who are experiencing homelessness can escape its clutches and become prominent adults who do not have any touches with that kind of experience. And so the policy fellow for Massachusetts who's joining us today is Mobile Burrell, who is the Assistant Director of Technical Assistance and Institute Initiatives at Silver Lining Mentoring. And I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves.
Peace, y'all. As Ashanti said, my name is Mobile, pronouns they, them, theirs, or any variation of my name. Mobes, Mobiwan, T-Mobile, whatever's clever, as long as it's respectful, I accept it. And she's already said my title, so I won't repeat it. But Silver Lining Mentoring has over 20 years experience matching young people in the greater Boston area who have been impacted by foster care with high quality, well-vetted mentors who are in turn supported by highly skilled, clinically informed staff, a lot of whom are on the webinar today. Peace, everyone, and welcome. We are a Boston-based organization founded in 2001 by Justin Pasquarello, who is a young person who had experience in foster care himself. We have a number of programs, including our flagship one-to-one program, our community-based mentoring or CBM program, where youth are matched one-to-one with a volunteer mentor for at least a year. We also have our life skills program for teens and young adults in preparation for independent adulthood, with a financial matching component so that young people are learning and earning while they're doing so. We have other pieces of our organization, but I don't want to take up too much time on the organization specifics. Happy to share more if you're interested, but welcome to everyone, and we appreciate you all joining us to hear more about homelessness in the greater Boston area and Massachusetts overall and what you all might be able to do. So passing it back to my colleague, Ashanti.
Thanks so much. And so as you heard, all of the work that Mobile does with Silver Lining Mentoring is why she was such a prominent fit here for the Policy Fellows Program. And so we are super happy to have you and have worked with you. We'll talk a little bit more about the work that Mobile has been able to do with the Policy Fellows Program and legislative advocacy. And so for today, we welcomed you so many times. And so we're going to get into our introduction to student homelessness and all of the political implications that it has. And then we'll talk about ways in which you can get involved in the work that we've been partnering with. And so please feel free to visit our website to learn more about our upcoming webinars if they're of any interest to you. And so this big number here, 1.1 million, right? That's how many young people who are students, pre-K through grade 12, who have been identified in their public schools as being homeless. And so, as you know, this number has been exacerbated by COVID-19, but it has also been lowered by COVID-19. And that's not necessarily because the pandemic has healed anything or filled any gaps, but because young people have been falling through the cracks. We have not been able to locate them or identify them. And a lot of the work that we try to do in terms of getting states the support that they need for the identification and enrollment of students comes through the McKinney-Vento Act, right? And all of the other legislative priorities that we have here at SchoolHouse Connection in order to find those young people and make sure that they're being connected to their local educational institutions and are thriving. And so as we all experience our own personal challenges with both work, home, and family, schools themselves have been challenged with identifying and communicating with students who are experiencing homelessness. As so many across the country lost their jobs, lost their homes, so many more young people have lost access to their schools and the connection that they needed to escape the clutches of youth homelessness. And so it's interesting when you think about homelessness because, the first thing that comes in your mind may be someone on the street, right? You may think about, people who, knock on your windows or are asking for money or holding signs outside. But one thing that we've learned with work with homelessness is that homelessness has many faces. It is way more than just being someone on the side of the road. It's staying in a motel, right? Whether it's paid for by a parent, out of pocket, or by some social service organization. It can also be what your life looks like post-eviction, right? Maybe staying with a family member, a friend, staying at a domestic violence shelter or any other type of shelter. And couch surfing is also a form of homelessness. And also multiple families sharing a residence that's not adequate for that many people, living doubled up or tripled up. That is a form of homelessness. And so it's really important to take stock of what all of these different phases of homelessness look like, because it's difficult sometimes for us as adults and advocates to recognize these things as homelessness. So imagine our young people who can have access to all of these resources, but can't really name their experience as homelessness. And so it's up to us to be able to identify what homelessness looks like for them, and we are able to connect them to the supports that they need. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mobile again to talk through what youth experiencing homelessness in Massachusetts has looked like over the past few years.
Yeah, so you can see on your screen some information about where young people who are experiencing homelessness in the state are spending the night. The total number of youth experiencing homelessness as reported from 2019 data is 24,658. And you can see from the data that the majority of the youth who completed the survey at least are doubled up. and then followed by those who are living in shelters. So as Ashanti mentioned, a lot of people might picture a young person who's living on the streets, but in reality, for students and young people who are completing these surveys, that they are in those double up situations or in shelters primarily. At Silver Lining Mentoring, we serve young people in foster care as well as those who have aged out. So those who have reached the age of majority without the state identifying a sufficient permanency plan for them. And a lot of those young people that we are serving have experienced homelessness at some point or are actively experiencing it. Particularly for those who have aged out or who are approaching that aging out, where they lose those supports that the state offers by way of housing supports, financial resources for things like food and clothing, etc. We at our organization believe that having a mentor is one way that youth can find support and a resource broker while navigating the stresses of trying to secure stable housing. And part of our work at SLM while we're vetting and training our mentors is that we are openly discussing the difficulties that the young people who mentors will be working with will be matched with, will be facing, including that housing instability, as well as what a mentor's role is. And I think the hardest part of our role is reminding mentors that they're not realistically going to solve a young person's problems, like getting them housing in the next year, because we know that's hard to come by, but rather their role is to accompany the young person on their journey as a thought partner, as a learning support, as a resource broker, and helping them get connected to resources that will ease kind of the journey along the way, essentially.
And I also just want to highlight that through the McKinney-Vento Act, liaisons, education liaisons and supports are available to young people. And so there's a link right here at the bottom of the presentation, which you will receive after the webinar, where you can find out where the homeless education liaisons are.
And then on the next slide, we can see that, so SLM as a whole works with young people, as we mentioned, who are experiencing out-of-home care in the state of Massachusetts. And one of our beliefs is that having access to an adult mentor, as I mentioned before, can really help a young person along that journey. So a survey that was done shows that 90% of young people who are completing this survey shows that they are able to identify at least one mentor. It's important to note that this data is completed from caregiver reporting, not directly from young youth reporting. So at least the caregiver is reporting that a young person has access to a mentor, but it would be curious to see what young people are reporting for themselves. You can also see data on children living with grandparent caregivers and children living with neither parent. These are young people who are not technically counted as youth in foster care. However, SLM works to serve young people who have been in foster care at some point. So a young person might have been in foster care in previous years, and then it may have returned to living with a grandparent or living in another kinship placement, and then are accessing a mentor through our program at this point. And the last thing that you'll see on your screen is some information about likely eviction. And we included this data because while these children are not experiencing homelessness currently, they are but a hair's breadth away from that stage. And these transitional experiences can really be challenging and have really negative impacts as being able to focus in school, being able to do life essentially without focusing on where you're going to lay your head at night. And so being able to have a mentor who can support you through that is one of the reasons that our organization exists. And part of why we're partnering with the SchoolHouse Connection in this fellowship is to make sure that we're able to do some advocacy for young people we know that we're serving who are going to experience homelessness in the future or who have already done so. And then this last slide, I keep talking about foster care since that is our organization's focus. And you can see from the first point that 1 in 5 young people exiting the safety net of foster care report experiencing homelessness between the ages of 17 and 19, and then 1 in 4 from ages 19 to 21. So youth who are transitioning out of care ideally are working on some sort of stability plan while they're planning to exit care. That doesn't always result in a clear clear stable residence or a source of income after they've aged out. So I think it's clear to see how that can lead to things like lack of access to employment, lack of access to adequate education, can continue feeding that pattern of homelessness where you don't have a secure income to support yourself. But in this conversation, we're focusing specifically on homelessness and education. So I will pass it back to my colleague Ashanti to dig deeper into there.
Thank you so much for highlighting this. And so there are a lot of connections and kind of dual identities that happen with young people who are aging out of foster care or even in foster care and homelessness. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the legislative priority that really covers that a little bit later during this presentation. And so as we've kind of been harping on, and what you may have picked up on is that homelessness and education have a really interesting relationship. In order for young people to escape youth homelessness as they become young adults, education is kind of the key connector to being able to take them from point A to point B. And 42% of students who have experienced homelessness say that they have dropped out of school at least once. And we already know that, having absences or, not being able to meet the minimum requirements, to get a passing grade or a diploma from a high school institution, right, is very difficult when you don't have a place to live, right? And so 42% of students have dropped out of school at least one time. And 60% say it was hard for obvious reasons to stay in school while they were experiencing homelessness. And, homelessness in itself is associated with an 87% likelihood of dropping out of school, chronic absenteeism, and disproportionate school discipline. And so, students may not always be able to keep up with uniforms, right? May not always be able to keep up with behavioral expectations because they may be, dealing with everything that's happening with not having a home, not having access to food, and all these other issues, right? But if our school culture isn't situated in a place that recognizes these issues, we unfortunately disproportionately discipline these students, which also pushes them out of school. And over time, the achievement gaps between homeless and low-income elementary students persist and even worsen over time. And so we have to, obviously, for very obvious reasons, remedy this through policy and legislation. And another reason why it's so imperative that young people excel in school and remain connected to their school of origin, just to end the kind of disruption that happens to their education. And having a high school diploma and GED is the single greatest indicator for escaping youth homelessness. Young people who do not have it are 346% more likely to experience homelessness as an adult. And more than 2/3 of jobs, as we all know, right, require some form of post-secondary education, whether that's technical school, an associate's degree, or maybe a 4-year institution. With you have only 1/3 of jobs that don't really need that, it makes it very competitive and nearly impossible for young people to have that sort of income stability. And so the McKinney-Vento Act in itself is a really important strategy to overcome homelessness, and it has been so even more during the pandemic because it also comes with flexible funding that allows folks who are holding the funds to be able to support young people with things that they may not necessarily associate with their education or homelessness, but it gives them the stability that they need to be able to access their education institution. And so the McKinney-Vento Act in itself removes barriers by keeping young people at their school of origin. So even if they're, house hopping or living doubled up with someone that's not necessarily in the same town or, near their old address, they'll be able to stay at their school. There's also transportation that's associated with McKinney-Vento that allows young people who may be a little bit further away to be able to get to their school. It also reduces the barriers that happens with changing schools. And so young people will be able to have access to immediate enrollment at the new school. If they were an eligible youth under the McKinney-Vento Act, there wouldn't be a gap in their education. And it also supports young people through graduation and beyond. So there are also higher ed implications with the McKinney-Vento Act as well, supporting young people through their FAFSA completion and there's another act that we'll talk about shortly that talks about higher education provisions. And so we talked a little bit about the faces of homelessness before. And so the McKinney-Vento Act really aligns with the federal definition of homelessness that has since been updated, right? And so it talks about all of these things, right? That young people who lack a fixed, like a stable, regular, and adequate nighttime residence are considered homeless. And so sharing housing with other people, facing any economic hardship that makes it difficult to maintain housing, living in motels or hotels or camping grounds or any other alternative accommodation is considered homeless under the definition. Also, living in an emergency or transitional shelter is a part of this definition as well, or living in either a public or a private place that's not regularly designed for accommodation. So, there may be some young people who may sleep at bus stops or in, train stations. These places are not designed, for accommodations, but young people will have to do what they have to do, and they oftentimes use them. And so that definition is also covered under this act. And so also living in a car, a parked and abandoned building, or anything that's considered substandard, bus or train station or anything like that. All of those things are considered eligible and covered under McKinney-Vento. And so I'm going to stop here for a second and just check the chat and the Q&A just to see if there are any particular questions that have risen up for anyone at this time. And of course, if there are none right now, we will have another space for questions at the end. I am not seeing anything coming up right now, so we're going to move along. Feel free to continue to put anything in the Q&A that comes up for you while we continue to speak. And so the dynamics of the 117th Congress. So bipartisan efforts are really, really important in trying to pass legislation that will support our young people experiencing homelessness because of the makeup of our House and Senate. So there's a 50-50 split in our Senate right now, with Vice President Harris being the tiebreaker. And so Democrats do control the White House, the House, and the Senate. And so they do have the power to set the policy agenda, right? However, it is a narrow majority in the House, okay? And the even split in the Senate means that bipartisan efforts are the way to go. Those are the things that we have to lean on. And so right now, I'll give a few minutes back to Mobile just to talk through their experience with the Policy Fellows program and advocating with your representative.
Sweet. So as Ashanti mentioned, our organization engaged with this policy fellowship. And this was, we do have 20 years of experience in mentoring, but we were complete noobs in this policy arena or policy advocacy arena. So we were really eager to learn from ground up, like who are we even talking about when we're talking about advocacy for young people, and then how do we go about doing that? And so the policy fellowship itself started us off as those noobs that we were, with a lot of people who had more experience, but was really a helpful refresher, I think, for all of us. To just get a foundational understanding of the Congress itself. What does it mean to put forth information to a representative or to their team? Who are all the people that we're talking about when we are saying, let's go meet with Congress, whether that be their one of their staffers or the congressperson directly. And so it was really helpful in the earlier parts of the fellowship itself to get some foundational knowledge as someone who personally didn't have any foundation in policy area and had a lot to learn. And so I started the fellowship itself with two very eager young people who were leaders in our organization, and they were able to share their own lived expertise with our organization as a whole in preparation for our congressional meetings. And then they were also able to share their experiences with Representative Catherine Clark's team to be able to talk about their experience as having been in homeless situations while trying to access higher education. And so overall was a great experience for both the young people to have their voices lifted up to the level where you're talking to your representatives about your own personal experience pretty directly, as well as the organization to get some footing in how we want to position ourselves moving forward to continue advocating for young people that we're serving, who we know have experienced homelessness and who are experiencing other areas that policy arenas are being talked about, but we don't have a direct connection to right now. So we really, I think, was most beneficial was learning how to clearly articulate what we are trying to get a congressperson to do. So the fellowship itself, I think they gave us a nice piece of paper that was like, here's how to introduce the conversation, and here's how to like frame what you're looking for, and here's how to ask questions that are very specific, and how to listen effectively, and like take note of how you might be able to offer expertise in the future. And so that was really useful for our team to be able to have access to in preparation for not only that first conversation, but for future conversations that we attempted to schedule, but note to self, it's really hard to schedule with the staffers sometimes. Also learned that through the process that it can be challenging to have your meeting go the way you thought it was going to go. So really being ready to pivot, and if someone's going to join 15 minutes late, then being able to cut that meeting in half and really get your key points out there. So the fellowship itself is really critical for us being able to just learn how to have those conversations and what to expect, as well as getting our voice out there as a leader and having young people who have experiences that could be really beneficial for Congress people to lift up in preparation to move forward acts that can benefit them. So Ashanti will tell you more about the specifics in a moment, but overall the experience was a great deal of learning for our team, and it's helped us grow skills as well as confidence in this very new area of focus for our work.
I'm really glad that you were able to have that type of experience. Dealing with Congress is not always easy, as you said. So I'm really happy that you felt really empowered through this process to be able to speak with your own representatives and advocate for the things that were important to you and the organization. And so we have, 3 of our top federal legislative priorities that will support homeless children, youth, and families. And so first is flexible funding to support homeless children and youth. Right now, we do not have enough funds to support the identification, enrollment, and, support to and through school for young people. And so there's obviously advocacy that's in that space, and we'll talk about that as we move forward through the presentation. The second priority is removing barriers to higher education for homeless and foster youth. And then we also have the Homeless Children and Youth Act. So these are the 3 things that we've been lifting up, trying to get bipartisan support for. And so the first is flexible funding for students experiencing homelessness. And so the ask has been for the country to really provide $800 million in flexible funding, which is like a 1% of what we typically are giving to K through 12. And itself. And so it seems like a big number because we don't have $800 million, but it is a drop in the bucket when it comes to, our leaders. And so, advocating for $800 million would really be able to move the appropriations level forward and allow us to more flexibility in supporting young people with all of their needs. And so a little bit more about the $800 million. And so $800 million would be 8 times what we are currently getting annually for young people. And around $100 million that we're getting right now only supports maybe 1 in 4 educational school districts. That leaves way too much, way too much to chance. When it comes to young people experiencing homelessness and being able to maintain access to education. And $800 million is more funding than the previous 10 years, more funding than we've gotten for, the EHCY combined, right? And so the ask is really that the level of funding be sustained moving forward so that we can continue to meet the needs of students experiencing homelessness and also expand the reach that this money is able to have to ensure that more young people are not falling through those cracks, because we know there are more than 1.1 million young people experiencing homelessness, but the money is just not there to support the identification and enrollment of these young people. Right. And next, we have the Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Foster Youth Act. We know it's a mouthful, right? But we call it the HESHFE Act, right? And so this is a bipartisan bill that aims to remove barriers to higher education, access and success, right? And so happy to say that, Representative Catherine Clark actually was one of the initial introducers of this bill, right? Go Massachusetts. And in the 115th Congress. So a couple of years ago, really lobbied for this, right? And so what this act would do is require the designation of higher education liaisons for homeless and foster youth. And so we talked through the fact that, all the states are supposed to have the McKinney-Vento liaison that supports K through 12 work, but, young people are still young people when they exit high school. And when they go to colleges and universities, they're still facing some of the same issues, that they were facing through K through 12, right? Not, may have to find documentation to support their homelessness, right, in order to receive money, federal funds for school. Also may not have stable housing. So what this act would do is require a plan for housing that supports young people who are experiencing homelessness, both during the semesters, but also during school breaks. And they'd also get priority for on-campus housing, just to make sure that they have that type of stability while they're trying to get their education. It also would support and provide homeless and foster youth with in-state tuition, right? So they're not paying anything extra than what's absolutely necessary for them to get an education. And there's a whole lot more that's covered under the HESH Act. And when you get the presentation, you can just click that link right there and it'll take you to read the full list of provisions. Okay. And then lastly, our third priority is the Homeless Children and Youth Act. And so what this does is really remedy what has been a huge flaw on the federal level in terms of the eligibility requirements to access HUD assistance, right? And so what this would do is align the federal definitions of homelessness by amending HUD's definition so that children and youth who are identified by any one of 8 federal programs, including the McKinney-Vento liaisons doing the K-12 work, they would then be eligible for HUD homeless assistance. Right. And so that's something we desperately need. We've been talking about the lack of funds, the lack of support with identifying young people. And so what this does is expand the ability for young people to be identified and then therefore eligible for, federal resources. It also would require HUD to not only take a look at what our federal priorities may be, but also to honor the local community priorities and needs. So, one community may say, we really, we need the, more flexibility, around transportation, right? It's not necessarily vouchers or anything that we have to focus on, right? But what this would do is say to HUD would be like, you know what, okay, that local community in Massachusetts really needs, more flexibility around transportation, and they would honor that. Right, this act would do that. And it also will help improve the data collection on homelessness so that we can have a more accurate picture on how many people are actually experiencing homelessness, how many people are at risk for homelessness. And then that will allow us to make a preemptive plan, right, both locally and federally, to say, okay, how can we reinforce our communities with the resources that they need to make sure that these people are supported, right, and can, change their situation. And so this bill, this act is super important just because it helps us to align our local priorities, help the federal, our federal priorities align with the local priorities. And so the ask of you all today, right, the reason that we brought you here was to not only talk about, what's happening locally in Massachusetts and the great work that Mobile and Silver Lining Mentoring are able to do for young people, but also to really lift up the policy priorities that would support that work, right? How do we ensure that outcomes are different for the young people who are, going through life in Massachusetts? And so the ask right here is to urge your U.S. representatives and senators, right, align with the advocacy that's been, being conducted by SchoolHouse Connection and by Silver Lining Mentoring, and urge your representatives and your senators to support, that $800 million allocation. How do we support robust, flexible funding for students who are experiencing homelessness, right? Also encourage our representatives to co-sponsor the HESH Act, right? And so Representative Clark did introduce this act, so you already have an ally, right? But we do need all of our representatives to, align themselves with this act and get it passed. And then lastly, ask our representatives to co-sponsor the Homeless Children and Youth Act. And so there may be some folks on here who are not, not from Massachusetts, who are just sitting in, just trying to get a sense of what's what. You can find your U.S. representative at www.house.gov, and you'll be able to support the work of all 3 of these priorities. And so I'm going to stop here again because we have a little bit of time. If anyone has any questions, any comments, we'll, take a few minutes just to look at that. Okay. I don't know, Mobile. I think we were pretty clear. Pretty clear and direct. No one seems to have any questions. Let's see what's coming here. Let's see. Yeah, like, are you willing to make the ask? You know, we'd love to hear a resounding yes from everyone in the chat. Thank you, Natalia, for saying great work. We really do appreciate that. All that. Yes, thanks. Yes, awesome. Great. I'm loving to see that folks are willing to make the ask to support our young people. And so I just also wanted to say thank you, not only for your time, but for your commitment as well. And so we also want to just give you a way to stay connected to not only the work Schoolhouse is doing, but how you can maintain connection locally and increase your own advocacy. And so this first bullet here, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mobile, because this is something locally. You could just tell folks a little bit more about it.
Awesome. And I think there's a question that came into the chat right as we were transitioning over to this slide. I want to bring to your attention.
Sure.
But the Rising to the Challenge Training Institute is something that the city of Boston is hosting. It's a series of webinars that it's no cost webinars, but they do ask you to register / RSVP for them. And they are between October 13th. So the first one has already happened through, I think, mid-November or early November. So there'll be information, I think, in the follow-up email with you all that will have the registration information for those series. So I encourage anyone who wants to have any more details about what the city of Boston has been doing specifically related to youth homelessness, encourage you to check some of those out.
Thanks so much for that. And Stephanie, I do see your comment here in the chat. And so Stephanie's question was, is there a movement to address the allowances that are allowed towards homeless youth? There are strict guidelines on what can be used and what cannot be used. I think it would be great to open those funds up to more uses. And it's a resounding yes. So what we're trying to do by advocating for more flexible funding, and that's what that flexibility is about, right? Making sure that there are more uses for the money. Young people, we cannot tell young people who are experiencing homelessness what it is they need, right? We have to allow them to be able to share that with us and be able to utilize those funds. And so yes, us advocating for that robust, flexible funding is what that movement is. And so we do encourage you, that seems to be something that's on your heart. So we do encourage you to commit to, saying to your legislator, we need you to advocate for this and co-sponsor this. And thank you, Natalia, for your commitment. Yes, thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. Okay. All right. And as we close out, I just want to give you guys a few resources. So first, to see if your member, your representative, your senator has signed on to be a co-sponsor of any one of those bills that we mentioned today, you can go to congress.gov and type in the bill number or the name of the legislation. And please do not try to remember them. We have them in the presentation that you'll get. And so you can just copy and paste that right into congress.gov, and you'll be able to see if your member has signed on. You can also check out your member's social media to see their priorities. And if they're not mentioning these three things, you can definitely utilize the toolkit that we'll send out to you. Also with the follow-up email that gives you some template LinkedIn, email, Twitter, and Facebook posts that you can send to your legislator. And it also gives you a way to find out the social media handles for your legislators as well. You can also sign up for our newsletter. Our e-newsletter goes out pretty periodically that gives you updates on the work that we're doing both on the state level and federally. And so you're able to, just keep up with any developments that we see happening with these three priorities. And then you can also check out Schoolhouse Connection's federal policy page that can give you a little bit more insight into these particular priorities and other federal priorities that we have. And you can always feel free to connect with me at Ashanti, ASHANTI @schoolhouseconnection.org. or my colleague Rod, who's been so excellent with moderating the chat for us today, and the Q&A, at Rod, that's RODD at schoolhouseconnection.org. Mobile, I don't know if you want to put your email in the chat, just in case there's anyone who's not familiar with you. I know that you have a few fans in here. So you can contact Mobile so you can keep up with the advocacy work that they're doing at Silver Lining Mentoring and more locally in Massachusetts. And so again, we'd like to thank you for your time. We really do appreciate you for taking the time to come out and look at the work that SchoolHouse Connection and our brilliant policy fellow Mobile has been doing. And we ask you to just stay connected with us, and you'll see, what's left in store. And so I encourage you all to have a great rest of your day, and look out for the follow-up email that'll have a slew of advocacy tools and ways that you can get started in this work. Have a great afternoon, everyone.